Hey guys, this is Chris,
And I'm Mike.
and welcome to No Limits, a Mid-Trap podcast bonus episode. This is our first bonus episode. Pretty excited about it.
And today we are bringing an interview to you with a good friend and friend of the podcast who has extensive experience working on Capitol Hill, dealing with matters of budget, and even working for the majority whip for a time. So he's going to bring some insight into what it's like in Washington leading up to a major budget vote or any legislation that's on the table. And so we'll turn it over to our interview with Andrew. Chris and I are here today with a special guest, Andrew Cavazos. How you doing?
Doing well. How are you guys doing?
Good, good.
Good.
Would you mind telling us a little bit about who you are, your background working in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, sure. So I started in DC in 2013. I started working for a congressman from Louisiana. Just started out kind of like everybody else as an intern, making coffee, getting papers, and then over time, more and more responsibility came. And this particular member of Congress won an internal election for party leadership, so he was elected majority whip while I was in working for him. So I got an opportunity to move over to the Capitol and take a close look at the infrastructure in place and the procedures in place to pass legislation in the United States House of Representatives. So I did that for just about 4.5 years, and then I moved over to the Federal Reserve, where I advised Jay Powell and the rest of the board on their relationships on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for coming on. We thought you would be a perfect person to help us as we discuss the first book in Vince Flynn's career called Term Limits, and a lot of it takes place in Washington and around the Hill. And so we have a few questions for you about what it's like to be on the inside and be working for such a prominent congressperson. We know you may not have read the book, but at least you would be able to give us and the listeners some insight into what it's like and if some of the things that take place are in any way realistic or not, or if they're just outside the realm of possibility.
Well, it's an interesting world, so let's dive into it.
You said you haven't read this. Have you read any sort of political thrillers? Do you have a favorite political thriller author? Or
I did Too Big to Fail. That was good. I mean, all the Treasury and Fed stuff and trying to bail out the banks and working with the White House. That was cool. I enjoyed that one. I mean, that's not a unique choice or anything special, but it's a good book.
I forgot you did a lot of work around the Fed. You were there for a little while, weren't you?
Or just about 2 years.
Term Limits is really based almost solely in the greater DC area in the lead up to a major budget vote with the current administration in the story. And so if you could just tell us a little bit about what Washington is like leading up to and ramping up to such an important vote, and what communication is between the Hill and the White House, and what say does the president have on a budget versus how much is Congress shaping the narrative?
Yeah, so when I first got to Washington, D.C., the insight was pretty limited for a number of reasons. The Republicans had just taken the majority in 2010, so a couple years after that. So they only had one of the three keys you need to pass a piece of legislation. You need the House, the Senate, and the White House. So we were negotiating with Harry Reid and President Obama at the time to get our priorities into pieces of legislation. It turns out when you only need a couple of Republican votes to get to 218, you don't have to give away the farm. So we were negotiating, trying to get as much as we could, but understanding we could only get so much. And we did that for a number of years until there were some midterms, I guess in 2014, where Republicans took the Senate. So then you had a better opportunity to negotiate. You had the House, the Senate, but you still needed that last piece in the White House. So it was hard to get exactly what you wanted, but it did improve the situation. And then shortly thereafter, my boss was elected to majority whip, so we got an up close view of what it's like to actually do this process. And we did it a little bit with President Obama. The particular piece of legislation that we worked on, pretty hand in glove with the White House, was TPA, which was Trans-Pacific Authority, a fast track procedure for implementing trade deals. The White House kind of said, we'll give you whatever we can in support, but it's kind of up to you to find the votes. We found the votes where we could. It was a priority for Republicans. It was a priority for Democrats. So we worked on that, a lot of phone calls, a lot of members coming into the office, A lot of meetings on the floor, a lot of votes, where we're pulling members aside, trying to figure out where the support is, where the problems are. So that was the first time we worked on a big piece of legislation with the administration. And of course, all that changes in 2016 with the election of the current administration, because now you have Republicans, so one party controlling all three keys: the House, the Senate, the White House. And that process got very close very fast. The first bill that we worked on out of the gate was healthcare. So we had HHS secretary coming on the Hill. We had OPM secretary on the Hill. The president was making phone calls. House members were diligently whipping members. Either phone calls flying around, draft bills flying around, amendments. Members themselves are trying to figure out what was going on. So I mean, it was very hectic. All the while we're making promises. Members are seeing what they can do. They're getting phone calls from their constituents. Businesses in the district are calling. I've got so and so employees. I can't take this hit, or I got to take this hit. We expanded Medicaid. We didn't expand Medicare.
You were just before mentioning about the negotiating that goes on, and there's a scene early on where the president is trying to get, and his chief of staff, to get every last vote, and there's a lot of back and forth. And one tactic is that the president has a list of congressmen to call, and particularly on his list are some impressionable freshman congressmen. And so one of the main characters, Michael O'Rourke, gets a call from the president trying to play up the power and the sway of the office to convince him to vote. And this freshman congressman holds his own on the phone and really stands up and says, if you don't cut this $5 million for a program that my constituents feel is a waste, I will not vote for your budget. Does it get down to the nitty gritty like that when the president makes a phone call to a more junior congressman that may be more impressionable?
Yeah, when 218 is the magic number and you're sitting at 216, 217, and you need one more vote, you pull out all the stops. I mean, this is the meeting between passage or failure. You have the president, you have, his dad, his mom, businesses in the district, you have friends, anybody you can think of that could help persuade that particular member to vote in your favor. Yeah, you make that push 100%. And members do highlight certain pieces of the bill that they don't like. A lot of the times starts with macro concerns. So they say the non-discretionary number in a budget is just way too high, and I can't get around that. And then you get them to agree to that, and then they say, well, I can agree to the top line discretionary number, but I think Department of Justice is way too high, or HHS is too high, or I want to go and get some other political riders into the bill. So they'll go that deep, but typically it's not the first thing out of their mouth. It's kind of the top line, numbers in the bill, some poison pill riders, if you will. But yeah, it's totally feasible that the president gets involved. A lot of times these are his priorities. I know the first part of the process is the House or the Senate, and that legislating is done through the legislative branch, but the president does have a role. He has to sign these bills, and so he wants things done. And he's got some say in the process because he's got some skin in the game. Yeah.
And so one more question about that is the role of the media. As you mentioned, you pull out all stops. We see in the book a chief of staff, very ruthless, very cunning, and willing to use and actually obsessed with the media and the public image and persona. So do you feel this is a good strategy? Because this character quickly recommends to the president to hold a press conference just on the eve of the vote, once they think the whip count is one vote in their favor. It just rubbed me as odd that on such loose data, this negotiating, they get final word that they might have one vote margin, and they go whole hog in front of the media saying it's going to pass, we're ready, we're confident. Is that a common tactic? Does that sound to you like a blunder to go out to the media that soon just based on a
Um,
flimsy whip count?
to me, it depends on the quality of your whip. There are different members have different abilities to determine who's where on a whip count. If you think you have a solid 218 and you have firm commitments from all those members, then yeah, you start doing the victory lap and see if you can, get more members to vote for it than 218. If you can get to 220, 230, 240 and show, that the conference is divided, that your party is united, united, and that, this bill does have all the support it needs. And a lot of times if you drive, big votes in the House, it puts pressure on the Senate and vice versa. If something's very bipartisan or even very partisan, all the Republicans in the House or all the Democrats in the House voted for or against. That will give some commentary to how the Senate or the House goes, depending on who moved first. So if you're sitting at 218, 219, and you want to put pressure on the members who've given the whip firm commitments, yeah, you go out and say we got the votes and we're going to the floor. And then what you do is if the president's in the Rose Garden telling you we got 219, whatever chamber is considering that bill probably ought to get a move on and put it on the floor right then and there and get the thing passed. So typically, when you get 218 and it's a high priority piece of legislation, you take it to the floor as soon as you got 218. You don't give members the opportunity to stew and think and you have the other side try to cut deals and rework particular provisions. So you can do it, yeah, you can do it, but you better make sure your whip count is solid before you start announcing victory.
I just have one more personal question I'm curious about. Of course, this genre, the pop fiction, thriller genre, has to have some pretty badass characters doing straight up badass things. Pretty neat that they write that into the persona of a freshman congressman from Minnesota. So there's a scene where during the ruthless tactics to get votes, someone is sent from a senator's office to intimidate this congressman in his office, and it turns into a confrontation when that pundit there to twist his arm proverbially gets his arm twist literally by the congressman who's willing to use violence after there's a few threats back and forth and there's a tape recorder and the congressman's going to go public, and so he actually physically and verbally they go back and forth in the office. Is that out of the realm of possibility, or are secret tape recorders in congressional offices, physical altercations, even small ones? Is it possible, or is that where we're just going into fiction here?
I don't know about the.
It is a good story, I'll tell you
I don't
that.
know about the physical arm twisting, but there's
Okay.
definitely political arm twisting. There's recording, there's leaking, there's on Capitol Hill, the number one currency is information. So the way you can get it and deliver it is, makes it useful. So yeah.
This book obviously is titled Term Limits, plays heavily on this idea that there needs to be a change in, while there are term limits for the presidency, there's not term limits for Senate or in Congress. So where's the current debate? I mean, when you were on the Hill, was there any talk about the change for term limits in a congressional sense? Did this ever come up, or did people not even talk about this?
No, so the idea it's an evergreen issue. It's something that's been around since the founding of this country. Members today do talk about it, but I would not say that the idea of term limits has wide support on Capitol Hill. Republicans typically support the idea more so than the folks across the aisle, but practically speaking, no Republican, I don't want to say no, but practically speaking, it's not a very popular issue. Theoretically, sure, I think some members appreciate it, and there are some conversations. Not to sound too cynical, it's hard for those who have seats in Congress to say, I'm ready to artificially end, my ability to serve my constituents. I think that's a hard thing to get members of Congress to agree to.
Right. Once you have this job, you want to keep it.
Antidote, maybe kind of a parallel to that, when it comes to chairmanships of particular committees. So, for example, I did a lot of work with the House Financial Services Committee. The House Republican rules say that there are term limits for having a chairmanship role. So you have no more than 6 years to serve in that role. So there are some instances where term limits have been imposed on a very small scale. So there's a nod to the kind of value that mechanism brings.
Right.
I do have one other, and this is going to be a very personal question, so I'd understand if it's too much. But a lot of this genre that we're reading and these books we're reviewing take place during times of violence. This particular book has assassination plots against multiple congresspeople, including senators, and even, spoiler alert, for the midpoint of the book, but the Speaker of the House is assassinated. And so what is Washington like when there is a threat of violence against our government officials? During a very tragic event on June 14th, 2017, in my hometown, Alexandria, Virginia, a number of congresspeople, including a U.S. Capitol Police officer and other aides, were violently attacked by a shooter at a softball field here right outside our nation's capital?
Well, I would say there was a tremendous show of faith and unity. There was no one who wasn't willing to, send us prayer cards, mass cards, stop by the office, see us, stop by the hospital, see my boss. So there was a lot of unity, a lot of prayers, and a lot of support for our way of life, and the fact that you can have open debate, you can disagree, but you should never resort to violence, over debate. So it was nice to see that in those times of violence, Americans do come together to protect, their way of life.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember that was a particularly hard time. So thanks for talking to us about it.
We like to always end this podcast by asking you, the person we're interviewing, ask them what they're currently consuming, in media, in text, in movies. Give a little insight. I know this is a crazy time right now. We're probably all consuming a lot more than we were, but so what are you currently watching or reading?
Yeah, I binge watched Waco on Netflix over the
I
last
want to
few
watch
days.
that.
Yeah, there was I couldn't believe that I didn't know more about that tragic ending. And it also has political implications around freedom of religion, freedom of speech. So I thought that was interesting. Um, I gotta admit though, a lot of my time is consumed by market news. I read a lot of Wall Street Journal, a lot of Bloomberg, trying to figure out what the heck coronavirus is doing to the economy and the markets that reflect companies in it. So that's
Right.
what's consuming my time these days.
I don't know if you've seen the show House of Cards or any political drama like West Wing, or I guess House of Cards is on Netflix, so they were able to show, be a little bit more mature in the content. But would you say that that's an accurate depiction of what it's like to be in politics? I mean, besides like the blatant killing of certain people, I'm sure that happens as well. But, would you say that that's pretty accurate about what goes on, like shows like that?
A lot of it is dramatization, but there is a real drive for members to develop mechanisms to get consensus to pass legislation that's in the interest of your constituents. I mean, a lot of members vote based on what their constituents and businesses back home are telling them, because ultimately those are the dollars and the votes that support the candidates come election day. So they're attuned to that.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure. Happy to do it.
Cool.
Read some Vince Flynn. You'll like him. The books are crazy, man. Absolutely
in
crazy.
your free time, and all your free time with your kids and yours. And as always, just let Mitch be Mitch. Just a disclaimer, guys, we're just simply two fans offering a discussion and reviews of some of our favorite books and characters. This podcast is not officially affiliated with Vince Flynn, Kyle Mills, or Simon & Schuster. But thank you to them for bringing us this wonderful world of Mitch Rapp.